Well, hello, my name is John Gray, and I've got a name for you, Danny Barker. Now, that name might not mean a lot to you, and unless you're a jazz scholar or historian, you've probably never heard the name. Got another name for you, the Fairview Baptist Brass Band. That band might not mean a lot to you either, and unless you're a brass band musician from New Orleans, you probably never heard of that band either. However, I'm sure you've heard of the great musicians and bands that this great man and these young musicians produced. Wynn Marsalis, Nicholas Payton, Leroy Jones, the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, the Rebirth Brass Band. I'm sure you heard of these musicians and bands. Well, the Fairview Baptist Brass Band, led by Mr. Danny Barker, spawned these and many other musicians and groups. So let's take a deeper look into this man's career and the cultural and educational legacy that he left us. Daniel Moses Barker was born on January 13, 1909 in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the rear building at this particular residence. At the time of Barker's birth, the lower French Quarter community was largely home to African American and Sicilian immigrant families. Barker grew up in a Creole of color family that embraced musical education, formal brass band performance, and dress. Danny Barker came up in New Orleans at a time when jazz was really just getting started. He came from one of those great musical clans of New Orleans, the Barberan family. Matter of fact, his grandfather played in a brass band with some of the early greats of jazz like King Oliver. One of Barker's earliest teachers in New Orleans was fellow banjoist Emmanuel Salies, with whom he also recorded. Known as the Banjo King of New Orleans in the 1920s, Barker toured with local bands along the Gulf Coast. He played with the Bouzan Kings, which was a street band early in New Orleans, and he also toured Mississippi with Little Brother Montgomery. Seeking new opportunities, Barker moved to New York in the 1930s. He recalls that on the day of his arrival in New York, his Uncle Paul took him to the Rhythm Club, where he saw an inspiring performance by McKinney's Cotton Pickers. It was their first performance in New York as a band. He had always dreamed of making it up to the big city, and now he was there.
When I began to see the light and see what was happening was around 1917 and 18. And it was a mass migration north. And I heard about the fabulous cities of Chicago, which seemed like they were so distant, New York, and the musicians were leaving, going to these places, and someday I want to see these cities. I had never seen snow, and I heard about I want to see snow one day. And so I said, well, a good way for me to get up there and to play is to learn an instrument. So I had my mind centered on learning one of the instruments. I tried the drum first, and the clarinet, then the ukulele craze came in. My aunt bought a ukulele, and she got disgusted of it, and she threw it in my lap, and I picked it up, and I was on my way from then on.
Barker bought this banjo up from New Orleans, and then within just a few short weeks, that banjo was stolen. And that was kind of the best thing that could have happened to Danny Barker, because at the time, in the beginning of the 1930s, banjo was kind of on its way on the outs with the big bands, and the guitar was really coming in. He learned to play the guitar very quickly, and he was able to compete with some of the great rhythm guitarists of that era. When he played with the big bands of the swing era, he played what's known as the Freddie Green style, big fat chords in the lower register of the guitar, and an even strum known as playing four to the bar or four to the floor. However, when in a smaller group setting, Danny Barker played more color tones, more extensions. He used chord substitutions. He even used syncopated rhythms in a seemingly effortless fashion. He would go on to work with a wide variety of musicians while in New York. People like Sidney Bechet, Fess Williams, James P. Johnson, Benny Carter, Cab Calloway,
Jelly Roll Morton, Baby Dodds, Mesro, and even Red Allen. By 1947, Danny Barker was fully involved in the Dixieland revival, appearing on the This Is Jazz radio series recording with Bunk Johnson. He had returned back to the banjo. But you know, Danny Barker wasn't just a side man. He was a recording artist in his own right. Save the Bones for Henry Jones is probably one of his best known recordings because it was ultimately recorded by Nat King Cole and Johnny Mercer. And you know, Danny Barker was the king of the double entendre, if not the triple entendre, it said in music. He wrote a lot of novelty songs, particularly for his wife, who was a blues singer called Blue Lou Barker. She wasn't a big star, but she was very good at what she did. Some would even regard her as the Bessie Smith of New Orleans. And what she did was some really good, low-down, naughty blues songs. Mr. Barker and his wife ultimately returned back to New Orleans in 1965. He took up a position as assistant to the curator at the New Orleans Jazz Museum. While back in New Orleans, Barker attended the Fairview Baptist Church, and in 1970, he was commissioned by Reverend Andrew Darby Jr., the pastor of Fairview Baptist Church, to form a Christian band. It has been something that he had always wanted to do, and so he took up this commission with great energy. Well, I came across this particular community outreach letter that Brother Danny Barker sent out to members of his community. The Fairview Baptist Church Christian Band. This band was organized in the year 1972 at the suggestion of Reverend Andrew Darby Jr., who is deeply interested in the activities of young people. He proposed the marching band idea to Danny Barker, who, assisted by Charlie Barberan, organized the band. Under Barker's and Barberan's direction, the band has been a success. Now Mr. Donald Polk has donated his much-needed services in the band direction. Quite a few youngsters have passed through the Fairview Band, becoming professional musicians. It is a grassroots self-help project. Your help is much appreciated. Donate a used instrument. Danny Barker. Barker initially started filling the band's ranks with folks from the neighborhood, musicians kin, church members, cousins. One particular child from the 7th Ward neighborhood, who was 12 at the time, was Leroy Jones. He began hosting the weekly rehearsals in his family's garage. He even recalls how Blue Lou Barker would bring the kids snacks at their rehearsals. At its peak, the band had about 30 members, who would sometimes split up into 3 different bands to go play 3 different gigs. Leroy Jones recalls how the whole concept seemed so fresh and new, noting that while Doc Paulin had some of his young sons playing in his band, a band that was made entirely of teenagers was unheard of. Barker decided that the idea of reading music might seem too intimidating to some of the children. So there was no sheet music at all at the Fairview practices, said trombonist Lucien Barberan, who started out actually on snare drum with the Fairview Baptist Band. Barker kept it simple. He would teach them melodies by playing songs on the banjo or guitar or spinning records of the Tuxedo or Olympia brass bands. Barberan recalls that then we would just follow by ear. Most would play the melody, and those who could improvise would provide harmonies and riffs beyond that. First they learned church hymns like Down by the Riverside, Just a Closer Walk with Thee, or The Friend We Have in Jesus. Then they learned more secular tunes, including Paul Barberan's Second Line and Bourbon Street Parade. Even young musicians who weren't formally Barker students were influenced by him. Trumpeter Kermit Ruffins recalled Barker driving his big Pontiac real slow through the streets of Treme and stopping to talk to him about music. Many of those youngsters would go on to play music professionally and have prestigious careers. Some of those musicians you may or may not have heard of include Leroy Jones and Greg Stafford, who I mentioned earlier, Herlin Riley, Tuba Fats, Wyndham Branford Marcellus, Kurt Joseph, Lucien Barberan, also mentioned earlier, Shannon Powell, Dr. Michael White, and more. So in closing, the legacy of Danny Barker has a lot to teach us as musicians and educators. He took on the responsibility of passing on a dying genre and culture to the next generation. It took planning and organizing. It took patience and understanding. It took competence and mastery of his craft. Former Fairview member Harry Sterling said, brass bands were run by a bunch of old men and they were dying and no one was trying to keep that tradition going. He went on to say that if Danny Barker hadn't kept the tradition alive, there would be no Hot 8, no Algiers Brass Band, no Soul Rebels, no Pinettes. So I'll follow by saying that the next time you hear any of the newer brass bands performing, or you see a second line in the streets of New Orleans, or hear any of those old gospel hymns played by a brass band, or you bear witness to many of the cultural practices still going on in the streets of New Orleans, just know that Danny Barker's commitment to preserving the culture that he felt gave so much to him is the reason why we enjoy the riches of New Orleans. The legacy of his work continues to give.